This woman destroyed her entire future in a single moment of honesty. Her name was Celeste, and at 29 years old, she watched her perfect life crumble because she chose to tell the truth about one devastating night. What she did would divide everyone who heard her story into two camps: those who called her a monster and those who wondered if they would have done the same thing. I'm Emma, and today on Mrs. Emma, I'm bringing you a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and what we owe to the dying. Celeste had what looked like the perfect life. 8 months engaged to Preston, wedding invitations already designed, a spring ceremony planned down to the last detail. Their apartment was cozy, their future seemed bright, and from the outside, they were the couple everyone envied. But if you looked closer, cracks were starting to show. Preston had a steady career that paid most of their bills while Celeste worked part-time. She told herself she was contributing by managing the household, planning their wedding, keeping their social calendar organized. But Preston was beginning to hint that maybe she should consider full-time employment. Not demands, just suggestions. Little comments here and there that made her defensive. There were other tensions, too. Preston didn't like when Celeste mentioned Holden, her ex-boyfriend of 6 years. And she mentioned him often. After all, 6 years is a substantial part of someone's life. Those memories don't just disappear because you're with someone new, but every time his name came up, Preston's jaw would tighten, his eyes would go distant. Celeste noticed his reactions but didn't stop. She felt entitled to her past, to her memories, to acknowledging that Holden had once been important to her. Meanwhile, Preston had his own behaviors that frustrated her. He'd check her phone when she left it out. He'd ask detailed questions about her day, wanting to know where she'd been and who she'd spoken with. When she'd push back, calling it controlling, he'd say he was just interested in her life. They'd argue in circles, neither one hearing the other. His friends annoyed her. Her friends annoyed him. Money became a growing source of tension. Trust was eroding, slowly, like water wearing away stone. But they were still engaged, still planning a future together, still believing they could make it work. It happened on a Tuesday evening in March. They were having dinner, something simple, probably pasta or takeout. Celeste's phone rang, and when she looked at the screen, her entire body went cold. It was Holden's sister. She answered, and the words she heard next stopped time. Holden was dead. Cancer. He was 31 years old. Celeste couldn't speak. She couldn't breathe. Preston kept asking what was wrong, his voice getting more urgent, but she couldn't form words. How could Holden be dead? How could someone so young just be gone? The truth was, she had known he was sick. They'd been texting occasionally, just checking in, staying friendly. He'd mentioned health problems, but she'd assumed it was stress, maybe a bad flu, nothing serious. He'd never told her it was cancer. He'd never told her he was dying. When she finally managed to tell Preston what happened, his reaction wasn't what she needed. Instead of pulling her close, instead of letting her fall apart, he started asking questions. When did you last talk to him? Why didn't you mention he was sick? How often were you two in contact? She tried to explain that she didn't know the details, that they weren't really in regular contact, but Preston had this look, this suspicious, hurt look that made her feel like she was on trial instead of grieving. The funeral destroyed her. Walking into that church and seeing Holden's family again, seeing all their old mutual friends, people she hadn't spoken to in years, it brought everything flooding back. His mother hugged her and sobbed, telling her how much Holden had loved her, how he'd never stopped talking about her even years after their breakup. During the service, Celeste cried until she couldn't breathe. She thought about all the plans they'd made when they were younger, all the dreams they'd shared, all the versions of the future they'd imagined together that would never happen now. Holden's sister gave a eulogy that mentioned their relationship. She talked about how those 6 years had been the happiest of his life, how he'd carried that love with him even after they'd gone their separate ways. At the reception afterward, people kept approaching Celeste with sympathetic eyes. They'd say things like, "You were the love of his life," and "he never got over you." Each comment was a knife in her heart. She stayed longer than she'd planned. Holden's college friends wanted to share stories, to remember the good times, and it felt healing to be with people who understood what she'd lost. Meanwhile, Preston was texting, asking when she'd be home. The messages felt cold, impatient, like he was more concerned about his dinner than her devastation. When she finally got home late that night, Preston was waiting up. He asked how it went, but his tone was wrong. It wasn't concern. It was irritation wrapped in fake sympathy. He started asking questions about who was there, what conversations she'd had. And that's when she realized Preston had never lost anyone important. He'd never had to grieve someone who had shaped who he was. He couldn't understand what she was feeling because he'd never felt it himself. But here's what Celeste hadn't told Preston, what she hadn't told anyone. The week before Holden died, he'd reached out to her directly. Not through social media, where mutual friends might see. He'd texted her personal number. At first, the conversation seemed innocent, just checking in, asking how she was. But then it got deeper, more vulnerable. He told her he was terrified, scared of dying, scared of being alone, scared of all the things he'd never get to experience. And her heart broke for him. How could it not? Imagine being 31 years old and facing death. Then he asked if she would come see him, just to talk, just to bring some comfort in his final days. What was she supposed to do? How do you say no to that? She told Preston she was going shopping with her sister that Saturday. The lie came easily because what choice did she have? She couldn't say, "My dying ex-boyfriend wants to see me one last time." Preston was already struggling with her grief. He would never understand this. When she arrived at Holden's apartment, the sight of him shocked her. He'd lost so much weight. The strong, vibrant man she'd known was gone, replaced by someone fragile and fading. They talked for hours about old memories, about regrets, about what comes after death. He kept thanking her for coming, saying most people had abandoned him when he got sick, that she was the only person who truly understood him. Then the conversation shifted. He talked about their relationship, how it was the best time of his life, how he'd never stopped loving her. She tried to keep appropriate boundaries, but seeing him so vulnerable, so scared, it broke something inside her. When he asked if she would stay the night, just so he wouldn't have to face another night alone with his terror, she couldn't refuse. What happened next still haunts her. Holden said he had one last request, one thing that would bring him peace before he died. He wanted to feel close to someone who loved him, to have one final moment of connection before everything ended. Looking at him, so sick and desperate and afraid, Celeste couldn't say no. So yes, they were intimate that night. But in her mind, it wasn't about betraying Preston. It wasn't about selfishness or cheating. It was about giving comfort to someone who was dying, about showing compassion in his darkest moment. She stayed until morning, holding him while he slept, knowing these might be some of his last peaceful hours. When she left, he thanked her over and over, said she'd given him something beautiful to hold on to in his final days. How could that be wrong? That's what she kept asking herself. The guilt consumed her after that. Not guilt about what she'd done, because she still believed it was right, but guilt about hiding it from Preston. She knew he'd never understand. He saw the world in black and white, right and wrong, with no room for gray areas or impossible situations. So she carried this enormous secret while trying to act normal. Every time Preston asked about her mood or why she seemed distant, she'd blame it on regular grief. But how do you explain that kind of emotional weight? She started picking fights over nothing. Dishes in the sink would make her explode. Forgotten groceries felt like betrayals. But really, she was just overwhelmed by the secret and Preston's constant questions about her emotional state. Preston kept trying to have conversations about their future, about moving forward, about getting back to normal. But nothing about this was normal. She'd just lost someone important, and Preston wanted her to bounce back like it meant nothing. When he suggested couples therapy, she actually laughed. What would they tell the therapist? That he couldn't handle her grieving properly? That he was jealous of a dead person? He'd analyze everything. If she seemed sad, he'd ask why. If she seemed okay, he'd ask if she was really okay, or just pretending. There was no winning. 3 weeks after the funeral, everything fell apart. She'd barely slept, kept having dreams about that last night with Holden. She was drowning in the secret. When Preston came home and immediately started questioning her mood, she snapped, told him she needed space to grieve without constant surveillance. But instead of listening, he got defensive. started listing all the ways he'd been supportive. Then he said something that ignited her anger. He said maybe she was too attached to Holden's memory, that it wasn't healthy to be this affected by an ex-boyfriend's death. The fight escalated fast. She accused him of being controlling. He accused her of shutting him out. Round and round they went, saying things that couldn't be unsaid. And then Preston asked the question that would end everything. Did you sleep with him? Just like that, out of nowhere. She could have lied, should have lied. But she was so tired of carrying the secret, so exhausted from his suspicion and questioning. And part of her wanted him to know the truth, to understand what real compassion looks like. So she told him everything, about Holden reaching out, about how scared he was, about spending that last night with him. She explained how it wasn't about betrayal. It was about showing mercy to someone dying and afraid. Preston's face went blank, completely empty. He just stared while she tried to explain the circumstances, how it wasn't planned, how it was Holden's final wish. But he wasn't hearing it. He started asking cold, logical questions about timelines and details, building a case against her. She tried to explain that she hadn't been lying, just protecting him from something he couldn't understand. But every explanation made him angrier. He threw her own words back at her. How she'd said she wasn't in regular contact with Holden. How she'd claimed she didn't know he was seriously sick. How she'd lied about where she was that Saturday. When she tried to explain that love isn't finite, that caring about Holden didn't diminish her feelings for Preston, he completely shut down. Started talking about trust and betrayal and how their entire relationship was built on lies. She reminded him about her childhood trauma from her parents' difficult divorce, how that affected her ability to navigate trust. But Preston acted like her past was irrelevant. Finally, she got frustrated, called him selfish, said a truly supportive partner would try to understand instead of making everything about his own ego. That's when Preston said the words that cut deepest. Being sad doesn't give you permission to cheat. Cheat. Like it was some random hookup instead of a dying man's final request for comfort. She started crying then, but Preston didn't soften like he usually did. He just sat there watching her cry like it was a performance he didn't believe. When logic didn't work, she got angry. Brought up every time he'd hurt her, every selfish moment, every failure. But Preston just looked at her like she was a stranger. Then he asked if there were other things she'd hidden. Other times she'd been in contact with Holden. Other lies. She told him about the occasional texts over the years, birthday messages, holiday check-ins. Nothing inappropriate, just friendly contact. But Preston treated every text like evidence of ongoing betrayal. Wanted to see her phone, read all their conversations. She refused. Some conversations were private. Holden had shared things about his illness and fears that weren't meant for anyone else. Preston started making demands. Cut contact with Holden's family. Stop posting about grief on social media. Pretend 6 years of her life never happened. When she refused, he threatened to call off the wedding. The next few days were brutal. Preston came by for his things but wouldn't really talk to her. After 2 years together, this was how it ended. She reached out to mutual friends for support, but everyone seemed uncomfortable getting involved. No one wanted to take sides. 3 months later, she discovered through social media that Preston was already dating someone new, a woman from his office, probably one of those women who'd been interested in him all along. The photos of them together made her sick. He looked happy, relaxed, like their entire relationship had meant nothing. What hurt most was how quickly he'd moved on. 2 years together, an engagement, wedding plans, and he was posting couple photos within months. The woman looked exactly like what you'd expect. Young, cheerful, probably never dealt with any real hardship. Meanwhile, Celeste was struggling. Without Preston's income, her part-time job barely covered rent. She had to ask her parents for help, which felt humiliating. Finding full-time work proved harder than expected, and Preston seemed to be thriving with a promotion and his new relationship. 6 months after the breakup, Celeste ran into Holden's sister at a grocery store. The encounter was awkward. When Celeste asked how the family was doing, his sister got a strange look on her face. They'd found some of Holden's journals while cleaning out his apartment. He'd written about their last night together, but not the way Celeste remembered it. According to what his sister told her, He'd described feeling guilty about asking her to come over, worried he was being selfish and unfair to her relationship with Preston. The journal entries made it sound like the whole thing had been his idea, like he'd manipulated her. His sister didn't say it directly, but Celeste could tell. Holden's family blamed her for taking advantage of him when he was vulnerable. The rumors spread through their old social circle. People who'd been sympathetic suddenly began treating her differently, like she was predatory. Preston got engaged to his new girlfriend after only 8 months of dating. The announcement felt like a slap in the face. What made it worse was seeing how his friends and family celebrated, acting like Celeste had never existed. A year later, she was barely surviving. She'd moved back in with her parents because she couldn't afford rent, the ultimate defeat at 30 years old. Preston and his new fiancé were planning to get married at the same venue Celeste had originally picked. But here's where Celeste's story takes a turn. She decided she was done feeling sorry for herself, done letting other people's judgments define who she was or what her actions meant. What she did for Holden was an act of love and compassion, and she refused to apologize for it anymore. Preston showed his true character when he abandoned her during the most difficult time of her life. A real partner would have tried to understand the impossible position she was in. Everyone wanted to act like she was the villain, but where were these people when she was dealing with genuine grief and loss? Too busy judging to offer real support. Preston could have his perfect life with his perfect fiancé. They could live in their bubble where nothing complicated ever happens. But when real life inevitably hits them, they'll realize how shallow their foundation really is. She started building a new life, one that didn't depend on other people's approval or understanding. She'd accepted that some people would always see her as the woman who cheated with her dying ex, and that was their problem, not hers. Sometimes she wondered if Preston ever thought about her, if he ever questioned whether he made the right choice. But honestly, it didn't matter anymore. He made his decision based on fear and insecurity. She made hers based on love and compassion. People could say whatever they wanted about what happened that night. They could twist it, judge it, use it as gossip. But she was there. She knew what it meant to Holden in his final days. She knew what it meant to her. And that was enough. So that's Celeste's story. The story of a woman who lost everything for showing mercy to someone she loved who was dying. Who was abandoned by someone she trusted when she needed support the most, and who learned that most people would rather judge than understand. But she's still standing, still believing that what she did was right, regardless of what anyone else thinks. And she says she sleeps fine at night knowing that Holden spent his last hours feeling loved instead of alone. That, to her, is worth more than Preston's approval ever was. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about Celeste's choice? Was she right to comfort Holden in his final days, even though it meant betraying Preston? Or do you think some boundaries should never be crossed, no matter the circumstances? This is one of those stories where good people can disagree, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think, made you feel something, or made you question what you'd do in an impossible situation, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates complex, real-life stories that don't have easy answers. And don't forget to subscribe to Mrs. Emma if you haven't already. I bring you stories like this every week. Stories that dig into the messy, complicated truth of human relationships and the choices we make when there are no good options. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Emma, and I'll see you in the next story.